Welcome to Out of Left Field, a show where your end of sport comrades share their takes on current issues in sport and justice. Sport is always political. Neutrality is a lie used to sanitize exploitation and sell the commodity spectacle. We're here to expose the power dynamics the industry tries to hide and destroy the illusion that a game is ever just a game. This is the end of sport. This is Out of Left Field.
Hi friends, and welcome back after yet another hiatus, but I'm hoping the last, or at least the last for a very long time, hiatus from the End of Sport podcast. My name is Nathan Coleman-Lamb, and I am joined today by my friend Derek Silva. Hey, Derek.
Hello, long time.
It has been too long. Actually,
yes.
I see Derek all the time, but you haven't seen us together, listeners, or heard us together. So it's been a long time for you folks. We are not joined today by our friend Johanna Mellis, who has been dealing with health and disability stuff, which has prevented her from being able to hop on the podcast too often. But she is hoping to be back with us at least sometimes in the near future. So we're very excited about that. And we have rather a large announcement to make today. And it's been tipped off for those of you who may be watching on YouTube right now, because, by the way, we are trying to post our episodes on YouTube. We're really trying to go all in these days. But for those who are just listening, our traditional listeners, we have a new member of the podcast crew. We would like to introduce you to our friend, Anna Posberg. Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes.
I think it's just like so cool to go from big time fan when you first started making these episodes during COVID and now being here. It's like multiple dreams come true. I'm so excited.
Yeah, we are super excited to have you on board.
We're thrilled to have you. And for listeners who maybe didn't catch those episodes, you can have one type of introduction to Anna by going back to our archive. We did an episode, God, time is really blurred together in my mind. So I'm actually struggling to remember what year this was, maybe 2024 now. I'm thinking like late in 2024, we talked about some of the transphobia that was sort of like brewing in the sports. I mean, we know that it's been brewing for years and years, but like, it was really, the shit was really hitting the fan with respect to the kind of Trumpist campaign, right? And so they were leaning into transphobia and the moral panic as part of that project. And so we were talking about San Jose State and all of those related issues. And it was, in my opinion, a really terrific episode. So you can check that one out. And then we also had a much more recent episode with Anna and Cherie Becker talking about their incredibly important work, kind of debunking some of these so-called scientific arguments, I guess, for trans exclusion in the world of sport. And that one is really much more of an evergreen episode because they're just sort of taking us through their scholarly work. But I would strongly recommend you check those things out. But so you may well already be familiar with Anna's work, and many of us in the world of sociology of sport are. But for those who are not, Anna, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you work on?
Absolutely. And this is perfect because I am frantically putting together my annual review materials. So this is fresh on my mind of what my identity is as a scholar. But yeah, so I am an assistant professor in the Department of Sport Management at Florida State University. I am not Floridian, to be very clear. And I think listeners of the podcast will know what that means. But I am originally from Minnesota, right outside of Minneapolis. I went to undergrad at the University of Minnesota, which I think we'll get into today, about Minneapolis. I went to Carnegie Mellon for my master's, and then I did my PhD at the University of Maryland in the Physical Cultural Studies program. And there, I became really interested in the intersections of gender, science, governance, and sport. And specifically this idea of protection, which I find it ironic. For those on the YouTube, I'm wearing a Protect the Dolls shirt today. But this word protection is really interesting, and it's weaponized so much in issues of gender, especially today. And so my dissertation looked at what does this word protection mean? Who is being protected? What is being protected, especially in policies relating to female eligibility, trans eligibility, and female athlete health. And that is kind of underlined my entire research career now. And so in the Department of Sport Management here, I focus especially on policies and how science, especially in these kind of intersections of gender, governance, women, sport, how science is weaponized under these discourses of protection, fairness, safety, to create policies around eligibility, especially trans eligibility, what that means, how science is chosen, what are the impacts of this too. And so there's a lot to research these days. It's not a very positive world in it, but I think it's really important research. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me. And again, really excited to be here.
It's incredibly important research, and it's obviously a theme that we've covered for a long time on this show, and we are very much intending to cover as long as we are compelled to by the transphobes of the world who insist upon making this a central issue of our political discourse. And we're going to actually talk a little bit about that even today. But before we get to that, I also want to introduce something else, which is really the concept of this show that you're listening to today, which is the first of a series that we kind of feel like we're launching right now, and we're intending to deliver to you bi-weekly. We're calling it Out of Left Field. And what we mean by that and by this sort of separate series, and you'll notice that we've numbered this series differently from our other episodes, most End of Sport episodes have been interviews, right? We conduct interviews with folks who have lived experience and expertise in various aspects of the world of sport, harm, and exploitation. And we're, of course, going to continue bringing that to you because that's central to our mission here at End of Sport. But in addition to that, we would like to now start offering you episodes that are a little bit more hot take based, a little bit more, responding to the world's events as they unfold in front of us. And there's, so much to get into, honestly, that we're going to have no shortage of material, I'm sorry to say, in a sense. But we really wanted to make sure that we have the opportunity and a kind of platform to bring more of our voices to you in that sense. And that's one of the reasons why we were so excited to invite Anna, a new member, into our group, because we want to have more capacity to give you End of Sport content, more End of Sport content. And with a larger team, we're really set up to do that. So the first thing we're going to get into today on that subject is what Anna mentioned. We got to talk about Minnesota, right? Because a lot has happened since we last talked to you. I don't remember when that was, but it was probably early in the fall of 2025. And obviously, in the ensuing period, the world has even further fallen apart, in a sense. And particularly in the United States, we have seen a literal war being waged on people residing in the United States, I'll say, to speak broadly. And I'm gonna throw this to Anna in a second, because I as a Minnesotan, I would really love to hear your perspective. But I would just say I actually read an amazing piece earlier today by former podcast guest Nikhil Pal Singh in Equator magazine, and the piece is called, sorry, I'm just pulling it up for myself right now, Homeland Empire. He sort of coins this terminology, Homeland Empire, to try to account for these simultaneous U.S. assaults within the hemisphere, especially, right? I mean, we know through Israel and so forth, it's not just been contained to this hemisphere, but the assaults on Venezuela, the threats to Greenland, this sort of external imperialist attitude of the United States, but simultaneously, so much of it is also happening internally to the United States, right? There's a war being waged on people within and without. And he terms that Homeland Empire. And it's the single best, I think, attempt so far to try to tie together all the threads. So I would just encourage folks to check that out. But Anna, tell me what you're hearing about Minnesota, because what I understand is that, frankly, mainstream media coverage of the war on Minneapolis, and we all know about the murder of Renee Good, for instance, that has certainly penetrated the general discourse. But my understanding is the day-to-day in Minneapolis is far more horrific than we understand. This is not just a few isolated instances where these people got out of hand. This is just a constant, literal war on the people of Minnesota.
Yeah, there's no other way to say it. And I fully agree with that. Most of my family is still out there. Most of my friends are still there. And just the stories they tell me, the videos they send, I have not yet seen a mainstream news media that does justice to the atrocities that are being conducted day to day. I think the only organizations that I've seen that are covering it somewhat appropriately are grassroots organizations, activist organizations, the organizations you would think that are on the ground every day out there fighting for justice and just like decent human treatment. But it's horrific. I've heard stories about folks who are worried about their spouses, like literally in their words, getting snatched up. Neighbors, restaurants have closed because they're concerned that ICE will come in and just like take their customers, take them. The violence that occurs every day. I think even just yesterday, I saw an article, a news story that came out of someone was running away from an ICE officer and got shot in the leg. And I was talking to someone the other day, and they were like, I'm just so grateful for cameras, like phone cameras, to exist these days, because how many times has this happened in history where it was never documented? And we just had to rely on mainstream media, on government officials to tell us what's going on. And in no way does it reflect how violent and scary it really is. And it's just heartbreak. Minneapolis has gone through a lot. And we can talk about it in the sports space too, but I've found it, I guess, like as a researcher and a Minnesotan, hearing and listening to folks parse through their identities as citizens and Minnesotans versus critical sports scholars, and have to kind of wrestle with what this means and how to balance that. And I don't know how to do it. It's so hard. It's just like almost hard to find words for it. And because of the anguish and pain and fear and hurt that come through all these stories, and I just feel anger, because why isn't the New York Times calling this what it is? They're like, it's like an incursion. No, it's not an incursion. Like, this is a militarized state that has become Minneapolis. You can't go a block without an ICE officer chasing you, following you, demanding for your identification, breaking your window, grabbing you, pushing you. If you're lucky, the ICE officer will slip on ice. Like, if you're lucky, it's horrific. Yeah, and again, I think that's all speaking as like a citizen and a Minnesotan. And if we think about it in a sports space, Minneapolis has the largest Somali East African population, I think, in the US, I want to say, or one of the largest. And there's been a lot of work to the University of Minnesota and the School of Kinesiology. Chelsea Thule has done phenomenal work on increasing access to physical activity for East African and Somali girls and women, and creating spaces for them to be able to wear culturally appropriate clothing and be physically active. And as a sports scholar, I just keep thinking, what does this mean in terms of setting those kind of gender equity issues, racial equity issues back? What does that mean? What can they come back from this? Will any of them ever not be terrified to go play basketball for 2 hours once a week? The consequences and implications, there's just so much. And that's my long thing about trying to think through Minneapolis, but it's horrific what's going on.
You know, I was watching the Raptors play yesterday against Indiana, the Pacers, and it's weird even to go kind of beyond, you know, the physical boundaries of Minneapolis. Just think, this is like, of course you could always speak to this, because this is the war coming home in that sense, right? Which has long been foretold. This is what happens, like with imperialism, that the wars that the U.S. has wrought upon the world. Well, we're seeing what they've inflicted upon Gaza, what has been inflicted upon Iraq, what has been inflicted upon Vietnam, and on, right? That's the kind of dynamic that we're seeing play out in the streets of the United States. And so what I'm about to say, this sort of notion of sport as spectacle, like that's always been true, right? Because this has always been the world that we've been a part of. But it is particularly striking when this is what is unfolding on the streets outside of stadia, for instance. This is like the lived reality for so many people in the United States right now, like a kind of life or death stakes and a lack of security of person fundamentally. It is so bizarre how the sports world just churns on business as usual. You know, you watch an NBA broadcast, you go on social media and you look at sports journalists and they're talking about free agent signings. Like, it is as if it's completely insulated. And it's just bizarre to me. Like, I wonder at what point does that finally break down when you're in in a literally fascist environment like this? At what point, or is this like this is complicity, right? This is just collaboration with that regime to go on as if it's business as usual.
And it's just bananas because I feel like professional sports go on as if like nothing is going on. And maybe we'll talk about being in Tallahassee. We had World Cross Country Championships here this past weekend, which was great. But like, think about the politics of hosting something like that in Florida. So it's not the professional sports that are impacted. It's the grassroots sports that are impacted. It's the youth sports that are impacted. And I would argue that those impacts are way more reverberating, concerning, and life-altering in that. Like, pro sports organizations will continue to make money, do whatever. But like, what about the kid who is separated from their parents and is 7 years old and doesn't know what's going on, or their parents are separated from them? And I think like that's what's so concerning to me is like you said, pro sports will continue on. They'll do their thing. But like, what about the other 90% of sports of youth, grassroots, high school levels?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I definitely think that the effects, the reverberations of this hyper militarized, I don't even know, like, what to call it at this point. Those are going to be felt so much more so and more hidden in youth sports. But like, I was thinking this morning, just thinking about this, and like the last time that sports kind of stopped, and it was in 2020, and it was in the NBA. So you had Milwaukee pull out of playing based on what was happening politically around the George Floyd protests and ultimately the Jacob Blake shooting. And I'm thinking to myself, what's the role of professional athletics in this? What is the role of professional athletes and their labor power in forcing social change? We saw, I guess, in a positive, if you will, sense in 2020 when in that setting. But we're seeing the Minnesota Timberwolves play. They played 2 nights ago, well after the murder, and I'm questioning: have we gone back in terms of resistance and the power of laborers? Have we gone backwards in terms of having that power to make or to sort of force change?
No, that's a great point, Derek. Because like, listen, so we wrote this piece in the Guardian, sometime in the fall, where we were trying to think about why more athletes were not speaking out about Gaza, right? And I mean, in some ways, the answers were not so surprising because a huge portion of that was, well, we're worried about losing sponsorships, and there's a sort of Palestine exception that we're all very familiar with. And there was some discussion of, well, we're kind of somewhat ignorant about this issue, and it's framed as a very complicated question. And because of that, it becomes a little bit easier for some people to choose silence over speech. But you know what? This is such a stark contrast to that, because no athlete can pretend that they don't know that this is happening. Yeah. I bet that they can't pretend that they don't have people that they know and are, or at least acquainted with in some way, who are experiencing this, right? I mean, not just in Minnesota, because this has been happening across the country, right? I mean, Chicago, war was waged on Chicago previously, and it's happened in many other cities, and it's going to continue happening, right? And I was just reading something that suggested that like there's a discourse that says that it's only happening in blue cities, but it's actually not only happening. It's happening in Idaho. It's happening all over the country. And so we should be asking the question, what do athletes have to say about this? What is their role? Because as we always point out, and anyone working in the space of the sociology of sport and beyond will understand, athletes have this disproportionately large platform to speak and have an impact if they choose to. This is why Kaepernick was so impactful. And
I don't know if you saw at the Wolves game, they had like a moment of silence, but during it, someone yelled, "Fuck ICE," like loudly, and the whole crowd cheered during it. I don't know if you saw that, but I remember seeing that, and I was like,
I did not see that.
You literally cannot claim I didn't know that, because at your game, like the whole crowd cheered for it. Wow. And like we always see, like women's sports though are the ones who speak out, and I think Minneapolis is
Minnesota has led that. Like the Minnesota Lynx WNBA team has been at the forefront,
and we have the Frost too now. We have a WPHL team too. We have the Frost, and so like I'm curious to see. I have my faith in women's sports to say and do something, and I'm curious if and what the Lynx will do, and if the Minnesota Frost does anything as well.
Because this is the key, right? We're in this space where two things. I mean, many things, but two things I'm thinking about are happening at the same time. One, it is genuinely terrifying to be confronted with fascism up close and personal. And I'm not experiencing that right now, I should add, right? I'm here in Canada, like I am not actually confronted with it in the way that I'm describing, but pretty much everyone in the United States is living that right now. And it's, again, there's fascism debate. So I'm not trying in this case to like sort of navigate the nuances of the debate, because we can have a conversation about like to what extent has the United States always had fascist qualities and so forth. And I'm not pushing back against that, but I would suggest that this is like at least a new modality of that fascism. This is like a form that most Americans are not familiar with living, right? What is transpiring right now. And that is genuinely frightening, and it genuinely compromises the security of person. And so I understand people being worried about not just their employment, but literally their safety, the safety of their family members and acquaintances. And that absolutely has an impact on one's decision and ability to speak. And I'm not being judgmental of that. Like I recognize that's, viscerally frightening. That's so real. But on the other hand, the other piece is the only way of ending this. It's not vote in 2026, turn Congress. No, that's not it. That's not going to get it done. Okay. Because if that's the attitude, then the strong arming process of fascism is just going to take that election, for lack of a better word, one way or another, take all the elections. There's not going to be some kind of passive, peaceful transition back to brunch, right? It requires people having courage. And I will say, what I understand about Minnesota right now, and you just gave us a great example of that, Anna, is that like Minnesotans are demonstrating that courage. That is what I'm understanding, is that people are putting themselves in danger in exactly the way that they need to. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is we also need to see that courage from elected officials. I saw just Malcolm Harris made this point. I think it was an excellent point. I just saw him make this on social media. He said, like, we're getting these milquetoast statements from fucking government officials, Tim Walz. The only role for those Democrat officials is to be on the streets with people confronting ICE. That is a meaningful and impactful action that is, I think, would really be emboldening for their fellow citizens to see them there. Like that's how you build strength, you build courage, you build solidarity. And that's the place I would love to see athletes to, finding that kind of courage. Imagine what that would mean for people to see some of their heroes on those streets with them. It's not without risk. It's incredibly risky. It's dangerous. But you know what? It's also fucking risky not to be out there.
I keep thinking, and I'm like transitioning topics, but it's relevant. Like the SCOTUS cases, the Supreme Court cases for trans athletes, there was a picture on ACLU of someone who had the sign, this NCAA champ says that trans athletes should be out, trans girls should and can play. Like that is the kind of advocacy. As your friendly neighborhood governance scholar, governance is top down, bottom up, and sideways. Like it comes from all directions, and you need to have that bottom up policy change, governance, advocacy work as well.
And you're so right to point out that this is violence happening on multiple levels. Like in Minnesota, it's one thing, but you're pointing to the World Cross Country Championships and violence happening outward to folks who are trying to come here to participate in sport that are increasingly put at risk, especially when we think of the context of the United States holding some of the biggest world mega events in the coming years in terms of the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup, the FIFA Men's World Cup. It's both outward and inward at the same time, which is it's wild to see that this is taking shape. And I think it actually highlights, or at least makes sport more important in terms of the resistance, as both of you are pointing out. Like if we are to see true resistance happening, it's not going to happen just from the streets of Minnesota. It has to happen from elected leaders. It has to happen from the people that have power, both discursively and also within the kind of governance structure as well. And this is where we really need athletes to speak out. Athletes need to speak out despite the structural coercion, despite all of the issues that, or the barriers to actually speaking out, to doing something. Despite those things, this is when sports are kind of needed most. And I'm optimistic, hesitantly optimistic that can actually happen. And the history shows us that there are certain areas and certain places where this can actually, or this tends to start. And I'm looking towards folks in women's sports, to be honest, because they've led the charge so many times on this front.
Let me pivot off that, Derek, because if we're talking about women's sports, right? This is related actually to the larger question of fascism. But this is me. Like, if these episodes are an opportunity for us to vent a little bit, like this is me. Yeah. Okay. Listeners know that we have long been absolutely infuriated at the way that the sort of language of protecting women's sports has been deployed. This goes back to, of course, Anna, what you're saying that all your work is about. But like this language of protecting women's sports is deployed to actually produce exclusion and violence against trans people and trans participation, right? And worse than that the campaigns that were conducted to prohibit trans people from participation in sport, the right, MAGA, this fascist movement seized upon that, right? And they saw that there was a kind of way in which that fed into a particular type of common sense, right, that people have. I'm not trying to claim that it's correct because but it's like a kind of traditional commonsensical logic. And it was in a way that became a Trojan horse for their larger project of, fascism and exclusion more broadly. Was like, this was a real wedge issue that they could move the entire Overton window really by talking about trans participation in sport. But who gave them? We know what they're doing, right? Like that's not even a question. Of course, these people are literally evil. Yeah. Like exactly. This is what fascists do. It's scapegoating. It's evil, but it's expected. But the thing, so it's like I'm angry, but I'm angry in an expected way. But like I'm galled though by the people in the world of sport who frame themselves as protecting women's sports, and they actively collaborated and they gave ammunition to this fascist movement. I actually think that they played an instrumental role, an outsized instrumental role, because their issue happened to become the issue of the day in this weird way that like doesn't make sense in terms of how many people are actually involved in it, but it became this overwhelming conversation, right? And these folks published in our journals, International Review, The Sociology of Sport, published the people doing what I'm talking about. Okay. They went on Fox News. This is what I mean by collaboration. They were platformed by the far right. They worked with the far right. They gave quotes to the far right. They built up Riley Gaines, darling of the fascist movement and grifter extraordinaire. Okay. They go on social media and they valorize this person. And then those people, and Kathy Devine is an example of one of these people, they come out and they say, this is all the Democrats' fault. This is the Democrats' fault because they didn't understand, like us, how important the issue of trans exclusion was. If they just got on the trans exclusion bandwagon, they would have won the election. That's bullshit. These people are taking no responsibility for the fact that they actively collaborated with fascists, and they have more responsibility than almost anyone alive for being in this moment, and they are still acting like someone else is to blame. And they should be excommunicated from public life, as far as I'm concerned. No, some of them call themselves leftists. They call themselves feminists. They call themselves whatever the fuck. They should have absolutely no place in our spaces. Okay? There is no solidarity with people who brought us here and continue to point the finger at trans people as if they have caused the kind of collapse of the liberal world system.
So many thoughts, yes, retweet, repost, whatever it is, all of this. But it's so boggling to me because when I was at Play the Game, which is a great conference every 3 years in Finland this past year, they had a big trans debate. I use debate in quotation marks. They had 5 folks on there, and it was like very, like John Pike was up there, who is a notorious anti-trans person. And he was up there literally pointing at the audience saying, you Democrats in the US, it's your fault Trump is in office. If you had just got on the right side of it for the trans quote issue, we wouldn't be in this mess. I'm like, okay, first of all, like, no. Second of all, actually, if you look at the freaking evidence, the Athlete Ally did a study like a year or two ago to see, in terms of your voting practices, what do you care about the most? Trans issues didn't break the top 30. Like, didn't break the top 30 issues. So actually, I don't think that it's positions on, I don't know, people being able to just exist and play sport regardless of their gender identity is the reason why we are in this militarized state in the US. Like, it's just factually incorrect. I don't believe in an objective truth. But in this case, I might be willing to compromise.
Because no one's hurt by it. No one is hurt by it. So that's why regular people don't actually have a strong feeling. They have to be, like, it has to be fomented in them, right? Like, once it becomes a discourse and it becomes a moral panic, then they get worried about it. But they're not, as you say, kind of like objectively worried about it because it's not harming them. It's not harmed a single person ever, unless you think losing at sports is a form of harm, in which case you have to fucking grow up.
Well, did you see, like, they on Instagram, there's like this reel going viral at the Supreme Court, like outside of the Supreme Court on Tuesday. There was someone being like, can you name 5 professional women's sports in like the anti-trans group? Nobody could name a single one. So actually, if you cared about women's sports, you'd be able to say like freaking Caitlin Clark, the easy go-to name, but like can't even name a single professional women's athlete. And like
half of them were I don't even watch women's sports. It's like,
what
is the issue? What?
And like, it's just mind boggling to me because I really do struggle with this. And I think about this a lot, of that kind of commonsensical knowledge. And I teach a sport governance class, and I tell my students, like, you can't make decisions off of vibes. Like, you have to have a rigorous, systematic, evidence-informed way to make your decisions. And for this, like, having done the research, like, we do the research, I literally do the research, there is actually no evidence to point to banning trans athletes as the most evidence-informed way forward. In fact, we had a piece come out about a month ago in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which is like the preeminent journal on like sports medicine, that argued that actually banning trans athletes, is a violation of medical integrity and scientific integrity. So like, but at the same time, like, it's this commonsensical idea of these binaries of gender. In Florida, we can't say women, so I say non-men, which I actually find more inclusive now. So you have your categories of men and non-men in sport, but you're deciding what these categories are. You're not actually looking at the evidence that's available. But that's what's so compelling about the anti-trans argument. They have that commonsensical knowledge, unfortunately, working in their favor, and they're annoyingly catchy and quick and clickbaity in what they say. And like, us on the side of justice and what I think is the right way forward, we care about nuance, we care about context, rightfully so, but it is really hard to package that in a clickbait headline. So if anyone listening has an idea of how to like reduce the importance of context and nuance without losing context and nuance, help a girl out. Like, let me know. But yeah,
part of the problem is because we care too much about sports. To me, this is actually a huge part of this problem. They always come back to fairness in sport. That's their number one piece, and all of this is fairness in sport, right? And of course, literally, your work, Anna, is about like interrogating that question, like whether they're even right to advance it. But I'm not even doing that, right? That's why I always say I'm stepping back from that for a second and saying, like, well, fairness is a question of ethics, right? That's what we're really talking about. We're talking about justice. We're talking about ethics when we talk about fairness. And the only way we can even have a conversation about fairness in sport that turns into a moral panic about like justice in society is if we think sport is somehow that important. It is as important as someone's ability to like have robust mental health, to feel that they can like live the identity that they have without being under threat, like a genocidal form of threat that tells them that they're not allowed to exist, right? That we're somehow making that state of being, that level of precarity, commensurate with did I finish in 5th place or 6th place in a swimming race? We are literally doing that. That is actually like, we have I mean, I know maybe it's a bit hyperbolical, and you're kind of suggesting that it is, Anna, but like we have arguably tilted to fascism on that question.
Mm-hmm.
But what's mind-boggling, so I can't even get the words out because I'm so mind-boggled, is when we think about fairness, we hear this rhetoric of like, well, I just want it to be about who's the best athlete, and like and men are the best athlete. Well, Derek, you brought up World Cross Country Championships in Tallahassee. At least 14 Ethiopian athletes were denied visas to come. And Ethiopia has historically, like I was reading an article about how like the last 6 or 7 world championships, they've dominated, but they could not bring their junior team here because they were literally just for no reason denied visas to come because the person in charge, Trump, decided he didn't want to give them visas. So if they actually cared about fairness and some kind of whatever they view as a meritocratic competition, they would have let those Ethiopians come in, but they didn't. And so it's not about fairness. And this extends beyond gender. And it just like grinds my gears because fairness is whatever you want it to be. We all know this, but like, stop trying to pretend it's this thing you actually care about. Because if you cared about it, you would be out there furious that people are being denied visas to come here to make good competition. You'd be furious about the anti-immigration policies that are in place. But crickets.
Yeah. It's wild because there's no single elite sport in existence that is fair in any way. And when we think of any modality of inequality, whether that be gendered, whether that be race-based, whether that be income-based, class-based, et cetera, every sport is by definition unfair. So when we're trying to do it through this fairness discourse, I find that like kind of laughable, but like I think it's actually easy because like people love the idea of meritocracy. We've that's proven in our entire political economy. People love that idea. And why sport is such a good wedge to do it through is like sport is one of the few like let's call it arenas, to use a sport analogy, one of the few like arenas that are left where gender and by extension now sex are so rigorously and deeply embedded in how we categorize. They're like, as our society has quote unquote evolved or changed over time, gender and sex have become less influential in terms of dichotomizing people. But sport is like, we're trained we're like ideologically trained that we play with boys or girls, and that continues on. And then there's a complete disconnect even from very young ages. So it's actually quite a smart play from the fascists to take that on. And I think like we need to develop some tools to attack that, knowing that the arguments are silly, the logic of the arguments are silly, but no matter the ideological coercion here is so embedded that that doesn't matter. The reality of it is meaningless. So what are those tools?
But on that note, that's a great like lesson, I feel, for thinking through what should become the most, in some ways, the most important terrain for us to be thinking through sport as a justice issue in the year 2026. Because if we're thinking about like fascism more broadly on a global scale, crucially on a global scale, we have a series of mega events that are about to transpire, right? We actually have the World Baseball Classic. You have pointed to the U.S. World Cross Country, the World Cross Country Championships. We have the World Baseball Classic, which, by the way, the United States is hosting in Miami, Israel, and Venezuela. They are going to be playing games in Miami, okay? In March. In March, that's happening. And then we have, of course, the World Cup of football, which is being hosted by Canada, Mexico, and crucially, the United States.
The men's World Cup.
The men's World Cup, precisely, exactly. And so this is a moment for us, though, to think, like you said, Derek, that we have to recognize that this fairness in sport discourse is politically effective, right? And so as opposed to like always fighting them on their turf, this is actually a chance to sort of like bring it back and say, all right, fairness in sport, you all care a lot about that. Well, let's think about the ways in which these countries, like the entire point of the World Cup in terms of as a commodity spectacle, right? Which is actually the point of it, right? Is that it's a commodity spectacle, and the reason it's successful as a commodity spectacle is because people will travel for the World Cup, right? They will actually travel. I actually can't even understand how people are traveling in the way they do for the World Cup, because the expenses that they are paying are so outrageous. Like they're spending, like they must be saving for years and years to have these opportunities, but it's that important to them, right? And yet, because of U.S. immigration policy, because we just have the most recent policy where 75 countries, right, have just been put on the list where they are pausing any kind of immigration processing. Now, that does not necessarily include tourist visas, technically, as someone reminded me on social media, and it's important to keep that technicality in mind. But still, right, the stakes of this are really clear. It is not safe for, well, I can say this firsthand. It's not even safe for Canadians to try to get into the United States, I will say from experience, right? So literally, it's not safe for anyone, anywhere in the world. It might be okay, but it's not like inherently safe for them to even try to cross that border. To even interface with that border is actually a dangerous move in this moment. That has huge repercussions for these enormous commodity spectacles. And it also has implications for fairness in the context of sport, because if they cannot travel, if they cannot have their fans there, then they lose competitive advantage. They may lose the ability to have certain players on the team because those players are banned, right? And so, frankly, I agree with you. We should be weaponizing that kind of language back and saying that this is like, there's a way that you can parody this World Cup and say this is like the Donald Trump. I don't have the language in mind.
Put an asterisk on it.
Right? Exactly. Put an asterisk on it.
Right.
Yeah, and I think like the word protect, I had such an issue with it for so long because I love that idea. Sorry. I love that idea of weaponizing language, because words are whatever it's very post-structural of me to say, but words are whatever you want them to mean. And so most of my shirts, every day I teach, I have a different shirt. I read the handbook, again, as your friendly neighborhood governance policy scholar. I read the handbook, and as long as I don't endorse a political candidate, I can wear whatever shirts I want. And so I believe in values and ideas. And so I have my Protect the Dolls shirt that I wear, Protect Trans Kids. I have a lot of shirts that say protect, but that's how I understand protecting. And like, we can make words mean whatever they want to mean. To your point also about like the concerns about safety and fairness, I keep thinking too, with this global shift right, if it works in asterisk, works according to Trump's vision, I don't know if he has a plan, but like whatever plan he has for the day, long term, whatever, what does this mean globally? Because there has been a wide shift right globally. And if we normalize this kind of militarized state, 50 years down the line, 60 years down the line, 70 years down the line, what do global sporting events look like then, even outside of the US? And so like thinking long term too, there is a scary precedent. And I not to like go back to Minnesota and Minneapolis, but Minneapolis have to hold the line here, because if they fall, what does that mean for Chicago? What does that mean for Sacramento? What does that mean for an Atlanta? What does that mean for New York, a DC, a Portland? There's scary precedents being set right now about, and having that kind of monopoly on these words of protection and fairness to mean a single definition. And so retweet Nathan of like, use these words, weaponize them, change the meaning, change the narrative there.
Yeah.
And this is a moment where everything hangs in the balance. I mean, you're right about that. This is, I've been seeing like, various reporting on different aspects of it. And one part of what's happening in the streets with ICE is that, of course, literally I saw the story today that because of an AI related error, they essentially allowed people who did not have law, and of course, again, we can problematize law enforcement. I'm not here to fetishize law enforcement as good or something like that, but I'm just saying that people who have law enforcement training have a kind of training. I mean, that's just an objective fact. They have a kind of training.
Yeah,
because
very
they have
shit.
That kind
very
of
shit
training.
and deadly training.
Agreed. But still, I think this point stands that they have training. And so it made some kind of sense for the Department of Homeland Security to be like, if you've already had that training, you need less of our other training, because essentially that training that Derek's talking about, you're already being trained to brutalize people in exactly the way we want you to be trained to brutalize people. So good job. Let's send you on the streets. But because they used AI in this idiotic way, it essentially selected anyone that had the word officer in their fucking job application was treated as if they were a law enforcement officer. Okay, so if they were like a customs officer, like just anything that had nothing to do with it, and so
governance officer,
all these people were immediately put on the streets who had no training whatsoever of any kind, other than in being a white supremacist, essentially, right? Because that's what this is. It's like January 6thers. These are like people who have a explicit white supremacist project have just been immediately thrown on the streets with weapons to attack people, right? So that's the horror of this. That's why this is so incredibly dangerous. That's why someone has been murdered and others have been harmed in various ways. But on the flip side, I'm also hearing reports from Minneapolis where people are saying like citizens, when I say citizens, I just mean members of the community are going around and harassing these officers, right? They're just like making noise, mocking them incessantly, like just trying to humiliate them in general. Like sometimes it's like a scary encounter where just like one person trying to like videotape it. I don't mean that. I mean, it's more like a group. Well, you know, that has a toll too. Like that's actually really hard emotionally for these officers to endure being the kind of butt of the community day after day. And so there's real value in that because that's demoralizing. That's why I say it's in the balance. Like this is and it goes to the points that you were both making, which is like, if, as you said, Anna, if Minneapolis yields, that's a precedent. They feel that sense of power and domination and like we know how it is in sports, momentum. There's like the momentum of like, we're on top and we're going to keep it up. And this is like, they're getting off on this. They literally are. That's why they're doing that job, is because they get off on that. Right. But if you mock them, humiliate them, undermine them, it's exactly the opposite. They want to run home with their tail between their legs. Right. And this is the moment to make that happen.
Yeah. And keep sharing the ICE videos of ICE officers falling on ice as much as you can, because they're both hilarious and objectively wonderful to watch. But on that note, I think this is a great first episode of Out of Left Field. We'd like to keep them, I think, short. I think that's the better way to do these. We could talk all day. I know all three of us.
Eric's always wanted short episodes. This is his dream.
That's correct. I will close and say that as a post-structuralist, once upon a time, and if you listen to the first episode of At the End of Sport, I called myself a Foucauldian, and Nathan turned me into a capital M Marxist. So
everyone will be carrying card carrying Marxists only on this podcast.
Yeah, so perhaps that shift might, who knows? But Anna, just welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you. And yeah, we really look forward to both this series, having you on the podcast, and rejuvenating the pod overall in the new year.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm just going to throw, because I listen to podcasts and I always love when they say this at the end. If anyone has anything we want to talk about on this series, throw it in the comments, because I think that we have such good chemistry as a group, and we'd love to just muse on it and think about it. Yeah. So, but most importantly, thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm super pumped for what we have coming. Love this.
Wonderful.